Hi tubers, and welcome back. In today's video I'm going to show how I changed the inner and outer tie rod ends on this 2000 Chevy Blazer. When driving this Blazer you can feel the front wheel just wobble. To get started I'm going to jack this Blazer up, take the front wheel off, and get the tools I need to complete this job. Alright guys, before we get started I want to point out the safety. It's been raining here like crazy for the last few days. Ground's a little soft. I have the Blazer jacked up and I have a jack stand, and in this case I put two. Just in case one should sink or it should slip a little bit, the other one's reinforcing it. Besides the jack stand, I have the wheels chucked on both sides. It doesn't take much to prevent an accident, but a lot can happen when you skip steps. Now, I'm doing this job without using any air tools. I'm just using basic tools. I have two screwdrivers. That's to lift the cap off so we can get to the lug nuts. I have the lug wrench. I have the needle nose pliers, a vice grip. Now I have that vice grip and the needle nose pliers. We get out this cotter pin. I don't know if you can see it. That cotter pin is a safety to keep that castle nut from unscrewing. Then I have my little solution of transmission fluid and oil to help loosen these nuts. We have a 13 millimeter and an 18 millimeter socket. 13 millimeters for these nuts here. The 18 millimeter is for this nut and this nut under here. Then we have the breaker bar, and we have a little leverage to help that breaker bar. Now I'm not going to use any of the tie rod ends, so if they don't come out, we have this pickle bar here that we would slide in, bang it with a hammer, and it pops it up. Most of the times you'll be able to hit it from the bottom. None of this is being reused. We have a hammer for persuasion, and we have a little extra persuasion just in case. A couple other pry bars. I have this pipe wrench. When it comes time to take these tie rods apart, we have the sleeve over here. I'm going to reuse the sleeve. It doesn't look bad. I'll use that pipe wrench to hold the sleeve while I unscrew the tie rod ends. We have the tie rod ends themselves. Before I take anything apart, I'm going to make sure they fit. This is the inner. This is the outer. And you could get them a little less expensive if you get them without the grease fittings, but by greasing these they'll last a little longer. So you have the hole for the fitting, and here's the fitting in the bag. I don't want to take anything out until it's time to put it in. And then there's a new cotter pin. It all comes together. And I had the grease gun inside, but I was low on grease, so we have an extra tube of grease. And then we have our torque wrench to get the right torque on these nuts when we put them back together. So to get started, first thing I'm going to do is remove this cotter pin. This bolt here doesn't have a cotter pin. Once I get these apart, I'm going to measure the distance of this tie rod end. Then I'm going to count the turns it takes me to get this outer rod and this inner rod. The reason for that is to get the alignment back as close as possible. This is going to need an alignment once this is done, but by getting it close to where it was, it'll give me time to bring it in for an alignment. And again, this will be measured from one point to the other, and I'll also count the threads. You can do either or. I'm going to do both. Now when I go to take this apart, as I mentioned, this cotter pin has to come out, the nut has to get unscrewed, this has to be popped out, this has to be unscrewed, this has to be popped out, and I'm going to start on that now. I'm going to put the camera down because all you'll see me is unbolting this nut, popping this out. If this comes out to be a problem, I'll put the camera back on it to show you a couple of ways of getting it off. But both of these ends look like they should pop out. As soon as I'm done with this, I'll be back for the installment. Okay guys, and this is what we're looking at. We have the inner tie rod end. You can see the movement on that. And then we have the outer tie rod end. Try to get some light on it. There we go. The outer tie rod end. So we have a lot of play on both sides. The weather's getting a little worse, and it looks like it might start raining on me soon. I hate to stop this job and restart it again, but I really don't want to be working out in the rain and the temperature's starting to drop. I ran into a little bit of a snag. Everything came off alright on this outer tie rod end. This inner tie rod end, this nut is stuck on the end. I tried taking the boot off and holding it with a pair of vice grips. It's just not working. When I turn this nut, the bolt spins with it. I don't have a torch to cut it off. I tried with a Sawzall, but the blades I have, they're not quality blades and they just didn't get anywhere. So the next step for me is I have a nut cracker that I'm going to try on this. And it's this tool here. This will slide over the nut. I'll crank it on this side and it should break that nut for me. Be back in a little while with the results. I made a cut on two sides of this nut. Now the nut turns without the bolt moving. Before I had a vice grip on there as tight as I can get it and it would still spin. Now with nothing holding it, you can see it doesn't spin. The nut's just coming off. This opened up the nut. That $2 tool, $1 tool, that $1 or $2, as I mentioned, I forgot what I spent, saved me a tremendous amount of work. I don't have a torch to cut this off, and holding the camera and the light over here, I'm having a little difficulty. So I'm going to take this nut off, and I'm going to take this inner and outer tie rod into the garage as one unit. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to measure from one end to the other, count the threads, and I'm going to try to get it back in as close as possible to the measurements that it is now. When it's done, it will need an alignment, but this will give me time until I get ties on the car to get that alignment. Alright guys, before we get started, I just want to show you. This is the nut that I couldn't get off the inner tie rod end. When I would turn the nut, the whole bolt would spin and I couldn't get it off. I tried holding it on with a vice grip. I tried prying it. Nothing would work. This is the nut cracker that I used. As I mentioned, I picked this up in a flea market one day, and it's a real simple process. You slide the nut cracker over the bolt. You turn this, use a ratchet with a cheetah bar, and this wedge will proceed to cut the nut. This nut was about the max that this nut cracker could hold, and what I did, I cut it on one end and the other. This loosened the nut enough to where I was able to turn it, and it came off without any problem afterwards. This is the nut that was on the outer tie rod end, and it came off with no problem whatsoever. Just came right out. Both tie rods popped out easily. There was no problem on that end. Now, here's that tie rod, inner and outer tie rod ends together. As I mentioned, I'm going to measure from one end to the other, and then I'm going to count the threads to get this as close as possible to the original distance. This will still have to be aligned, but it'll give me enough time to get it into a shop. Now to take this apart, we have a 1/2 inch nut holding the brackets. You can see I had that penetrating oil on this for couple of days now. We'll see what it's going to take to get it apart. It should come off easy enough. Oh, and by the way, these tie rod ends, they're the same size. What I did find that was a little concerning, the inner tie rod end on the boot, it has these bands holding it on. The one that I took off had clips on it, but the outer tie rod end doesn't have anything holding it. As a matter of fact, this boot was off and I had to push it on. Now the pressure should be holding it in, and I bought these at Advance Auto. I called up Advance Auto to see if this was just a defective one or not put together properly, and he says that's how they are. So I'm going to take his word for it, put it in. The one I took off did have a band on both ends. And by the way, both of these do have grease in them. So now to get started, I'm going to loosen these nuts. I'm going to be giving myself a little leverage. I'm going to use the socket, and I'm going to use my leverage bar here. Using this wrench to hold it. Actually start it. I won't even need it. Once you freed it up somewhat, I use the other wrench to keep that nut from spinning. Now we'll do the same for the other. Okay. These two nuts holding the bracket are now loose. I'm going to measure from one point to the other. If we go from the inside of this grease fitting to the inside of the other grease fitting, we have 13 and 5/8 inches. That's 13 and 5/8 inches. Okay. Now we'll count the turns on this. I'm using 2 pipe wrenches for this. You could use a vise. You could get a regular wrench on here. The pipe wrench gives me a little extra leverage. You want to be careful you don't distort the sleeve. If you do, just pick up another one. So, and if you see the configuration, they're opposite, about 90 degrees of one another. Okay guys, I had to go off camera. I was having a hard time loosening this tie rod end, but I don't know if you can see it in here. There was a lot of rust that was accumulated in there and it just wouldn't break free. It was too hard to turn. I then soaked it in this rust eater that I had, I don't know how many years ago I bought this. This is about the best penetrating spray that I ever bought. Can't find it, and it doesn't seem like anybody has it anymore, but if you find this, grab as many cans of it as you can. Soaked it with that, and now it turns easily by hand. I have to say I lost count on how many turns it took to get it out, because what I was doing was turning it in and turning it out, trying to break it free. So now I'm going to have to go by that measurement I took, and that's the only thing I have to go by. I'm going off camera again to take this out, and then I'm going to clean in here. I don't know if the camera could pick it up, but you can see the penetrating oil that this was soaked with. There's quite a bit of debris in there. I'm just going to clean that out with a little steel gas and a toothbrush. I'm going to put the ends back together, measure the distance between them, put in the grease fittings. They do have grease in them, but I'm going to put just a little dab of grease in there, grease the other fittings that are under the truck, and then we'll tighten it up. Then she'll be ready for the alignment. And the next recording will be me installing this on the Blazer. Alright guys, we got it all together. We have the new tie rod end, the outer tie rod end on this end, and the inner tie rod end. Cotter pins in, have it greased. Now, I'm not giving the specifications on the torque because I went online and I had all different numbers. I have to check it. I used an average of the torques of what was given online. I didn't want to strip them out. I definitely didn't want them to be too loose. So I have to check with a shop to see what those torques actually are. We have the outer tie rod end, the inner tie rod end, and these two nuts on the sleeve to hold it together. Well, I hope you found this video useful, and if so, give a thumbs up, comment, pass it along, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe. Until next time, stay safe.